And Amy and Sam, what about for disclosure? Why was now the right time for this, or the most important time for this story to be told?
Amy? Amy, do you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, as Sam described, it was such a perfect storm of, on the one hand, Laverne Cox appearing on the cover of Time magazine, looking beautiful and defiant and, symbol of power, and Time magazine declaring a transgender tipping point, and the trans community becoming increasingly, under attack, and the lives of trans people not improving because there were celebrities on the red carpet. Though not to belittle those moments that, were hard won, but when I joined this project, Sam was about 6 months in, it was just this dizzying time of, oh, you're making, a film about trans visibility. It's, people on the outside of the community would assume that this was going to be a celebration and we were going to interview Caitlyn Jenner, and show how far we'd come. And really, there was such a complicated history that had never been told, and a sense of urgency to tell it now.
Sam, anything to add? You feel
I
like
think
you
that's
covered
great. Yeah.
it? Great. Well, Sam, I know you both you directed the film, and then you worked with editor Stacey Goldate, who's a wonderfully talented editor. Can you tell us a little bit about your collaborative process and sort of how you and Stacey worked together?
Yeah, I mean, before I, well, actually, when I started making films, I was editing as well, and I thought that that would kind of be my bread and butter, was to edit. And then I very quickly realized that that's not a good match for me to work for someone else. Like, I'm much better working for myself. So, a director, I think a lot of directors can relate to that, for better or for worse. With my second film with Kate Bornstein, I brought on an editor and kind of got my experience of working with an editor, and it's a very intimate experience. And I think, the challenge is, for directors, we have it all in our head. Like, it's very clear what we want and we know how to get there. And it's like, how do you transport that into words to describe to someone else who has a million ideas and has experience, and editors want to do that. They want to be able to read your mind. So it's this very intense relationship. But my process, because I have a background in editing, I'm shooting to edit. I'm interviewing to edit. I research to edit. So I'm thinking about it all the time. And even the way I'm asking my questions is in this like storytelling format. And I log all my footage. So I get I don't have an assistant editor. Stacey had an assistant editor, but I kind of did my own assistant editing to really understand the footage. And when I say log it, I'm watching like 1 to 3 minutes and, putting in very detailed notes. And so I often
And
create.
just for anybody who hasn't seen the mass of archival that I mean, you were shooting original content, but then there was just this amazing archival that really helped build out the story, that I know you spent a lot of time with that archival. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I mean, the archival was like, that's where I did so much of my organizing, because I would, there was no book on the topic, so we had to create the primary resource to then base the film on, and that was done through about, I mean, basically researching the entire 5 years, but really the bulk of the first 3 years were just intense archival research, and found ultimately over 400 film clips and 600 television clips. So I had this database, where I had, I love my Excel databases, and I had all my columns breaking everything down. And then in Premiere, I was creating, these little bins of themes and tropes and, repetition, and I had it chronologically, I had it thematically, just so many different ways of organizing the material, so that when, then we have the interviews, we were really able to create that flow of like, what is the story we're seeing in the images. And just by watching the archival, I was learning so much, right? So just like, one example of just digging into the archival, something that I learned, which sounds obvious, but it hadn't really occurred to me at the time. Like, we now understand this image of, a non-trans man in a dress is often, a stand-in for a trans woman, right? That's how, like, Hollywood likes to show trans women up until very recently. Hopefully up until Disclosure, and now we won't see that anymore. But, when you look in the history of film, like, that is one of the first images people were filming. Like, even in these Edison tests, which Edison wasn't actually doing, it was just in his studio, these other directors were doing. But we have a clip of these female impersonators in a dress, and it's, whether it was for a story, which sometimes it was, or it was just for these tests. Even the first on-screen kiss was between a non-trans man in a dress and a non-trans man, right? And they kiss. And so this idea of always being a site of fascination, this idea of characters that transgress gender expectations has always been there. But what I found was, that image of a non-trans man in a dress at that time in the late, 1800s, that was a stand-in for sexism, right? Like, that was a stand-in for misogyny of, oh, how silly women are, right? Because these characters were just being silly and falling or breaking things or whatever. It was just a punchline. Then, you go to like the 50s, 60s, and that character then becomes a stand-in for the gay man. Same exact character, right? But now it's a gay man. And then you fast forward 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to the present, that character then becomes a stand-in for a trans woman. So that was so interesting just to look at the archival, and so that was a lot of the work I was doing in preparation. And then, we shot all these interviews. Stacey came on board. She spent, first, I just wanted her to get familiar with everything, and she was game. So I think she spent about, 8 weeks just watching everything and taking her own notes. And then she and I got together, for these marathon sessions of kind of figuring out, she liked to use the word pod, like we made these pods. So just figuring out what the pods would be, and we had rules for ourselves, everything had to be based on a personal anecdote. And then, whatever issue, historical, social, political, had to stem from that personal anecdote. So we had our touchstones of films, we had our touchstones of stories, we have touchstones of history, and then we had these huge, those Post-it notes everywhere, and we had our color coding system, which was really fun, and that's kind of how we got organized. And then we made these pods, and then the pods, get strung out to a 4-hour assembly, and then you freak out because you can't imagine making a film out of that, and you fight and you struggle, and then eventually you get into Sundance, so you have to figure it out, make your film.
And you mentioned that you were editing in Premiere Pro. Can you talk a little bit about why that decision was made?
Yeah, when I started, the first editing class I took was at this tiny place in Park Slope, Brooklyn. It was called Dyke TV at the time, and it fell apart because they actually didn't want to include trans men at one point. Fell apart for other reasons, but anyway. And it was Premiere Pro that I took my first editing class in. And so that is, early 2000s, probably like 2002, 2003. And then Final Cut kind of started to take over the world, the editing world. And I learned Final Cut. But then by the time I was making Disclosure, Final Cut kind of became more of a standard in colleges, right? And I was teaching at the time, so it was Final Cut X or 10. And so it really wasn't working. And everyone was talking about Premiere and how it had advanced and how it was just, there were so many more possibilities and working remotely and organizing and be able to work across different softwares. And so I gave it a shot, and it was just a seamless transition. Actually, Stacey had been working in Avid, but I told her I wanted her to learn Premiere, and she picked it up really quickly. And it was great. I mean, it did everything and more than I had worked with before in the other softwares. It was so easy to share files, just email each other a file. As long as we both had all the footage on a hard drive at our stations, all we had to do was email a very tiny file to share updates. So it was perfect for our purposes. I mean, we were doing, remote editing, even though we lived, in the same neighborhood, but just because we were both literally
and
editing.
Who could have known what the future held for remote work filmmaking?
I know. So I'm hearing people now be like, "Oh my God, remote editing." I'm like, no, that's what we do now. Like, it's not just COVID. Like, be happy that we got Premiere. But so that's from the beginning to end. That's what we use. And still now, if I have to go make changes, I go into my Premiere file, and it's fantastic, And The updates were really seamless, because it's constantly, the bugs are getting fixed and you're constantly updating, and it's streamlined really well.
Great, good to
A
hear.
lot of headaches.
And Christopher, you both edited and directed your film. Can you talk a little bit about what you see are the benefits, but also the challenges involved with sort of having a multi-hyphenate role on a production?
Yeah, I mean, for this particular project, I didn't expect to be the editor. I had actually we had some other editors in mind, and they had read the script. They were already excited to work on it, but just because of the timing of production, it ended up not working out. They ended up being stuck on other projects longer, and so when we first started, I thought, I'll just start editing this one. I right out of film school, I was an editor I was a documentary editor for about 10 years. And that's how I made my living, paid rent. And I still do that. So I'm very comfortable editing. And so I thought, I edited my first feature, August at Akiko's. And so I thought, I'll just start editing, and then we'll hand off the project at some point to someone else. But that just never happened. I don't know why. But it's hard. I don't especially, I can't say I love it. I like the fact that I'm able to just open up the project at any hours, and roll out of bed. I just edit on this computer right here, in my room, and just roll out of bed and just start editing first thing in the morning, edit late at night. I like that sort of flexibility. But the other thing is, I get lost. Like, without having that other person to bounce ideas off of and to collaborate with, it's one of those things, like, I start to drive myself crazy. But I'm really lucky in that I have a producing partner who's very, very involved. And I have other people who I've just known over the years that will watch stuff all the time and give me really honest feedback. And so if I didn't have that, I think I would just go crazy. So I'm constantly showing stuff to people. I'm constantly being like, watch this 20-minute thing. Tell me if it's working. Tell me what's not working. And that's the only way I can get a little objectivity, because otherwise I'm just sort of like in my head, like pounding my head against the wall.
Yeah,
it's hard, but I'm lucky that I have those collaborators to bounce ideas off of.
it's interesting you bring that up, because I do feel like it's a very important part, and maybe the scariest part of filmmaking is sharing your work and getting the feedback, and starting to open it up to more and more eyes. And obviously that next step is, okay, now we're ready to submit to film festivals and actually be, judged, and is it going to be good enough, and how did you always know that you were going to go the film festival route? And if so, why was that, your choice of the trajectory for this film?
Yeah, it's, as an independent film, we just thought that was going to be the best way to just get it seen. It was all independently funded, so we didn't have any sort of restrictions on how we can introduce the film to the world, or anything set up before making the film. And so film festivals are just, for me, it's something I'm used to as well. I love the film festival circuit. I love being able to go talk to audiences. And so we always knew that was going to be that was going to be the way we went.
And how about for disclosure, Amy? Did you always know that the film festival route was the way you were going to take this film?
That was the dream, for sure. I think, when we started out, and realizing there had never been a history of trans representation in Hollywood, there was very much an idea, oh, this is really going to be so valuable for trans audiences. But simultaneously, I think, we saw how meaningful it would be to have a wider audience, and wanted so much to watch in community, and for that community to feel like, we were reaching beyond our immediate circle.